Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Tom Stalker and Dr. Marilyn Warburton about the third edition of the book, Crops and Man. Crops have grown together with humans for thousands of years, but how have they influenced each other along the way? This episode, Tom and Marilyn walk us through how crops and humans have gone hand in hand. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsors, starting with Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Our second sponsor is Gazmat Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers. Visit www.gazmat.com, that's Gazmat spelled Gasmet, or email sales@gazmat.com for more information. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today we have Tom Stalker and Marilyn Warburton with us. Tom received his undergraduate and master's degrees at the University of Arizona and his PhD in genetics at the University of Illinois in 1977. He then joined the faculty at North Carolina State University and last year retired as a professor emeritus. Dr. Stalker collected and maintained the wild species collection of peanut, studied their genetics and evolution, and released many germplasm lines that are in the pedigrees of peanut cultivars in 30 countries. He traveled extensively in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and helped organize the National Association of Plant Breeders and the International Peanut Genomics Initiative. Tom was editor of Peanut Science for 13 years and president of the American Peanut Research and Education Society. Dr. Stalker is a fellow of the Crop Science Society of America, the American Society of Agronomy, and the American Peanut Research and Education Society, and received many awards, including the Crop Science Society Mayer Medal for Plant Genetic Resources. Marilyn is from Tucson, Arizona, and obtained a bachelor's and master's in plant breeding at the University of Arizona and a PhD in molecular genetics from the University of California at Davis. She worked for 10 years at the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Mexico on the measurement of genetic diversity and gene flow and how they influence conservation and use of maize and wheat gene bank collections. Currently, Warburton works for the USDA ARS to identify genes that will improve maize resistance to fungi and insects and create new tools to enhance the practical utility of this data. She is the incoming president of the Crop Science Society of America and the past editor of the journal Crop Science. She's authored many journal articles and book chapters, but this is her first book. Welcome to the show. How are you both doing today?
Oh, very well. Thank you.
Great. Very happy to be here.
Great. We are very happy to have you. So today we are talking about the new edition of your book, Crops and Man. And just to get us started, can you tell us a bit about the book itself? Obviously, this is the third edition. You both have strong ties to the original author, Jack Harlan. And yeah, just tell me more about the book, why you wrote it, who it's for, what it's about. Go for it.
Well, the book was written because we wanted to honor Jack Harlan in many ways. He was a great plant evolutionist. He provided many theories of plant evolution and germplasm. He collected extensively, and the book that he wrote in the 1970s and 90s, he wrote two editions, previous editions, is rather out of date, and we wanted to update that book and to present new ideas of evolution to modern plant science students and people interested in plant evolution.
I read this book when I was an undergraduate. It was actually a gift from Dr. Stalker, who I'll tell you is my uncle. So this book really sparked a lifelong interest in crop evolution and conservation of genetic diversity for me. And over the years, like when I go to different meetings and stuff, I've heard other people say the same thing. So we wanted people today to get the same benefit from this well-loved classic, but we wanted to update it. And we realized that a lot of universities are teaching that who teach about agriculture. They've added a lot of courses in the last 15 to 20 years in molecular genetics, biochemistry, bioinformatics. And a lot of the basic principles of crop evolution are no longer being offered in these courses. So this book can familiarize plant science students and the interested general public with the principles of crop plant evolution in a format that we think is easy to read and understand. But we also wanted to put forth some of the ideas and hypotheses that Harlan originally came up with. A lot of his hypotheses have been really bolstered in the light of more recent evidence collected with new tools like DNA sequence data and new archaeological data. So some of his most significant works over the years include that he collected more than 12,000 crop-related accessions. These are distinct varieties. They come from 45 different countries, and a lot of them became the parents of current varieties and helped to build modern agricultural production of important crops like wheat. Now, he proposed a concept called the compilospecies. These are related species, and they intermate to form hybrid swarms that expand the range and adaptation of those species. He also introduced the importance of crops and their companion weeds, because the weeds can intergress with the crops to create new variation. And this is like the previous concept. This will expand the adaptation and the resistance of crop plants to different stresses. Now, he modified Vavilov's original concept of the centers of origin. Turns out that the centers of origin are hard to pinpoint in retrospect. They really are centers of diversity, but a lot of times these are not the same place as where a crop originated. And in fact, not all crops have a distinct center of origin at all. So Harlan revised these centers into larger areas, and this can be useful to crop conservation. And then Harlan's research allowed him to determine that domestication resulted from a bunch of different reasons. There wasn't one reason that crops were domesticated. And then probably his most well-known was the gene pool classification system. So taxonomists were having a hard time using morphological classification to define crop species according to groups as proposed by Linnaeus. So domesticated species of plants and animals, they span so much diversity in form, like different sizes and colors and shapes. In fact, I often wonder how Chihuahuas recognize that they're in the same species as a St. Bernard, but they are. And so using gene pools to group plants based on how easy it is for the plants to intermate, this allows things that might look really different to be described with their proper relationships. The audience for this book, the new edition of this book, we hoped to bring it to the attention of undergraduates and graduate students who are interested in plant breeding, botany, agronomy, and the plant sciences in general, but also anyone interested in crop plant evolution would find it worth reading. The book is not highly technical. Harlan's conversational style makes it a really good read, and we've tried to preserve his writing style and new sections added to the book. And then if you're interested in where your food comes from, and you really should be, this book is the story from the very beginning.
That is an excellent summary. Yeah, I was just reading it this morning, and it's really, really enjoyable to read. It's very pleasant. He's got a great style. It's very, very charming. And as everyone knows, I don't come from a background in these sciences, and I was hanging in there without much effort. So it's definitely not overly jargon filled. So yeah, the book is jam-packed with information, and we could spend hours and hours and hours dissecting everything, or just get the book and read it. But today we're going to focus in on just kind of the first chapter of early sections of the book, really, to give you a bit of a teaser. And to do that, we're going to be looking at three eras, maybe is the right term, for the relationship between crops and humans as they have grown together and domesticated each other, as the book alludes. So to get us started, can we talk about the golden age and the hunter-gatherer sort of transition / era?
The hunter-gatherer peoples of the world have always been stigmatized by this idea that they weren't intelligent, that they didn't have any civilization per se. They were very primitive people, but that really wasn't true. And this concept that they were very primitive still holds true for many people. But starting in about the 1960s, there was a lot of work done on the evolution of plants. And it was found out that they actually understood the life cycles of plants very, very well. They had names, although not the names we use. They had names for the different parts of the plant, including the seeds, the anthers, the leaves, stems, et cetera, et cetera. They knew how to utilize plants. So look at all the detoxification of plants that they did. They had to detoxify acorns in California. They detoxified the toxins in legumes and the solanaceous plants. Manioc and the root crops had a lot of toxins in them, and they heated or leached out all those toxins by sometimes very complex methods. They knew a lot about drugs and poisons. They made poisonous arrows and spears. They knew a lot about drugs and medicine, and unfortunately, a lot of that knowledge has been lost over the centuries since hunter-gatherers first evolved. They had specialized plants for rituals. They used certain colored plants and seeds for plants and to paint themselves. They had special drugs that they used in certain parts of the world, particularly the Southwest and in parts of Africa, when they had rituals. Most importantly, I think that they manipulated the vegetation by burning and sometimes even flooding fields long before they cultivated or domesticated plants. People seem to be afraid of the field, afraid of the forest. And because they were afraid of the forest, wild animals, and it was dangerous, they did a lot of burning and created safe places. And then they would collect the plants that were in these safe places to eat instead of going into the high forest. There was a lot of taboos that they had long before cultivation, as they dug up tubers, for instance, in yams in Africa. There was taboos against harvesting these tubers before they were ready and could be the tops chopped off and stuck back into the ground so they could actually be useful again the next season. So they had a lot of practices that lended themselves easily to cultivation and eventually domestication. And they were really very, very intelligent beings, and they lived well for the most part. There wasn't an overpopulation, of course. Farming societies in ancient times experienced widespread famine. The hunter-gatherer societies did not experience famines. or they did a little bit, but they did occur, but they were rather rare. And their diet was better. There's a lot of evidence through bone densities and the amount of cavities that people had that showed that actually the hunter-gatherers were much healthier than the early farmers. And that was long before sugar was used. In Africa, there was approximately 1,400 species that were gathered and eaten, including grasses, legumes, roots and tubers, oil seeds, spices and vegetables and nuts and fruits. And many genera in Australia. There was almost 100 genera collected by the Aborigines in Australia. So they knew a lot about a lot of different plants, and they utilized them. They had a lot of leisure time. There was evidence that they only spent maybe 2.5 days a week actually gathering food, where modern farmers spend days and days, sometimes 7 days a week from sunup to sundown, collecting food. And the hunter-gatherers did about everything that farmers did. They owned land, made cloth, they made canoes and bows and arrows, they cleared land, but they didn't work as hard. And the question really is, since they didn't work as hard and food in general wasn't really that difficult to come by because they knew a lot about their environment, is why did they farm? It's a big mystery to a lot of us as to why you would put in all that work to farm when a hunter-gatherer society lived pretty well before they did farm.
Yeah, I was so glad, because as I was reading, I was like, wow, that sounds pretty nice. And I had that exact question, and the end of the chapter was like, that is the question. So I liked that a lot. But I do have one question before we maybe move on to that bigger question, which is, since these people were doing a lot of things that you would associate with farmers, irrigation, paying attention to the crop life cycles and having harvest times and that kind of thing, what is your definition of the differences between cultivation, domestication, and then gathering, I guess? Like, what are your distinctions between those terms?
Well, a gatherer collects plant material or animals to eat, essentially, or to use for whatever purpose from the natural environment. For instance, in the Middle East, there was huge stands of wheat, and there was no need to cultivate or farm. They could just go and harvest wheat and use it, or barley or rye, the same as people do that have domesticated wheat. Cultivation is disturbing the soil with a hoe or a stick or by whatever method, planting seed and then gathering it. Domestication, however, is the results from cultivated plants that are genetically modified through selection, and that selection just happens because of the process of recurring, planting the seed into the ground, harvesting it, planting the seed into the ground, harvesting it. For instance, there's natural selection then for seed not to shatter, which is to fall off the plant. You want the seed to stay on the stem so you can collect it and thresh it. There's natural selection for larger seed or more seed. So there's a lot of selection pressure for different traits. And domesticated plants can't grow without man. If you drop a cob of corn in the ground, the next year you'll have corn plants. but in 10 years, there won't be any corn in that field. It takes recurring harvesting, storage by man, and preserving by man to preserve that domesticated plant.
We also point out in this chapter that a lot of the gatherers are modifying the environment to the whole point. They're disturbing the soil, they're disturbing the plants by burning, by flooding, that the whole landscape changes, and the whole landscape supports more edible plants. So this whole landscape becomes a cultivated landscape instead of a cultivated individual crop. So the difference between farming and gathering gets a little blurred at some points, except that the gatherers were doing it with less effort.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Tom and Marilyn's book, Harlan's Crops and Man, is now available for purchase. Use discount code FWR35 for 15% off through December 15th, 2021. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Gazmat Technologies and Meter Group. For Gazmat Technologies, conduct greenhouse gas flux measurements in the field using the GT5000 Terra. Weighing 20.7 pounds, splash-proof IP54 rated, internal pump and battery, and vibration resistant, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for fieldwork. Visit www.gazmat.com or email sales@gazmat.com for more information. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's the message I got. So thank you for clearing that up. I know that was just a little point that I was like, well, what is the difference? So that's really helpful. With that in mind, I think we can then maybe transition into our next era, which is industrialization. So can you talk about how we switched from this golden age hunter-gatherer situation into the industrialization period?
Well, moving past just gathering, moving to the point where you're actually planting, taking care of the crop, harvesting it, taking care of the seeds, and then replanting it. So this whole plant domestication was happening all over the world by several thousand years ago. The geography of plant domestication studies what species were domesticated in different places, what they were used for, and how the species spread. And we talk a lot about these. So, for example, many species or genera were domesticated in multiple regions of the world independently. So if you look at different species of cotton, for example, were domesticated in the Old World and 2 different species in the New World, but they were all used for fiber. But then crops were not always used for the same thing in different places. So if you look at amaranth, in the Americas, it was used like a cereal, whereas in Asia, it was used as a vegetable called a pot herb. And they can also have multiple uses of the same species in the same place. So barley, for example, was used for flour, for porridge, for animal fodder, and for malt for brewing beer in Europe and in the Near East, all the same species. Of each species, hundreds or even thousands of land races were actually developed by all the different farmers. Farmers developed specific types by selecting them in each local environment or for different uses. The reasons for selection were sometimes not apparent to outside observers. Harlan noticed that farmers were harvesting a landrace of crook-necked sorghum. The top of the stalk of the sorghum plant were bent over. And he found that once it was harvested, these could be hung up over the hearth in the home so that the smoke would discourage weevils, which was pretty ingenious. Sometimes you see different red ears of corn in a white or yellow cornfield in Mexico, and these are encouraged for luck by the farmers. A lot of different land races were selected for different nutrients, and the farmers and the consumers could tell the difference, which corn variety was higher in protein, for example. And then sometimes they were just selected because they were pretty. So lots of different reasons. Now, land races generally are not adapted to high fertility or high yields, but they're dependable year after year because of a high level of variation within the land race. So they've been extremely important in modern crop improvement as well, because they're very variable. They have genetic resistance against diseases or insects. They have resistance for drought, for flood, cold, heat, salinity, and they have hybrid vigor, which is enabled by genetic variation. The reason that each landrace had so much variation within it is that if there was a drought one year, some of the plants would die, but some would resist and would still come to fruition, and the family would have something to eat that year. If there was the next year, maybe there'd be too much rain and it would flood. Other individuals would still flower, would still grow, would still give you enough to feed your family on for the year. So this was very important. But starting in the last century, modern improved varieties, which are much more higher yielding, began to replace some of the land races. So about the 1930s, there was some concern about the loss of land races and all of this important genetic variability that we need. And soon after, the gene banks were formed.
I have a couple of questions off of that. So first question, for people who are not in the know, including myself, how would you describe or define a land race? Because I know there's, species, varieties, accessions. Like, where does land race fall within that cluster of many related terms?
Right. Land races are also often called heirloom varieties. They're the varieties that were developed by the farmers themselves and usually kept in the family and handed down generation after generation. And usually the farmers are quite proud of them and are frequently specifically good for something. Maybe this watermelon is sweeter, maybe that maize landrace will grow better at high altitudes. Okay, so there's usually something about each one. Every one of them are different from each other. They are varieties, but they are not modern varieties, and many of them are no longer grown.
Okay, that helps. And then my second question then is, as far as the term industrialization for this period that we're talking about, do you find that it's more defined by this period of people moving towards the domestication of these crops and taking a more active hand in cultivation? Or do you find it's more tied to, for example, technology, like eventually, obviously not right away, like tractors? I know when people talk about industrialization, it's often tied to this, high output kind of process or approach, as well as maybe technological advances that facilitate those. So where are you getting the name from for this period?
So Tom will probably want to add something, but a lot of people feel that large civilizations began to be built only after you had a stable food supply with enough surplus that you could feed workers while they build large buildings, for example. Actually, new archaeological evidence suggests that this is not always the obvious chain of events. And in addition, I think actually that sometimes it was the other way around, that you had to build large cities and granaries and tractors and technology in order to continue to harvest and safely store your harvest. That it didn't lead to or allow the industrialization, but we became a slave of industrialization in order to continue to harvest more. So perhaps Tom will want to add something.
Well, you have to remember that until about 100 years ago, that about 85 or 90% of the population farmed. They had rather primitive tools. Even after iron and other metals were used for cultivation, there wasn't very many advances. They were either pulled by humans or by work animals to till the soil. Most of the planting was done, the rice was transplanted, it still is, or holes were punched into the soil with a stick and seeds were put in. Agriculture was rather primitive throughout the whole era of industrialization of big factories. They just didn't have those big factories and farms. People just did things the way they always did them. And they had some new tools, but not really that many until you had tractors and modern machinery, chemicals. They didn't have the chemical sprays to control weeds. They had to hoe all the weeds. So Marilyn's correct that they had to have granaries and ways to store things. And once you started agriculture, then the system just self-perpetuated. Cities were built, populations grew. It was sort of a one-way street. It was hard to go back. After you have population centers, you can't really go back to hunting and gathering. Then you just continue farming, and that's the way it's happened for 10,000 years until the last 100 years, when we've had modern plant breeding and sort of the modern era that kicked into society.
Great. Yeah, bit of a chicken egg scenario there, or maybe a yes and situation might be the better way to describe that. And I think that leads us perfectly into the modern era. Can you tell us more about kind of where we are now?
Well, as I see where we are now, we have in the industrialized world and spreading to lesser developed countries, the prevalence of tractors, modern machinery. You have larger and larger farms. There's fewer people farming and more people living in cities. For instance, in the United States, there's only about 4% of the population now farming versus 85% 100 years ago. We have large farms. They're very specialized. Production is very high. Plant breeders have done a fairly good job, not a fairly good job, they've done an absolutely tremendous job of improving yields and quality. They have developed varieties that don't get stressed as much because of drought. But at the same time, as the new varieties have come in, we're now dependent on fewer and fewer crops, and within a crop, fewer and fewer varieties of that crop. When you go to the grocery store today, you don't see a lot of different types of tomatoes. You see 2 or 3 types of tomatoes. A lot of people say, and myself included, that they don't taste as good as they did in the 1950s and 60s. A lot of the heirloom varieties have a completely different flavor than the types that can be packaged, stored, shipped, because we ship among countries and within countries. We don't grow all of our food locally. Our food comes from all over the world. And some of it is stored for a very, very long time. A very few crops feed most of the people of the world. Most of the carbohydrates or the calories that people get are from corn, wheat, and rice. The old crops like barley and sorghum and the millets, the oats and rye are very important on regional levels, but they're not important in major industrialized countries, and they don't really feed what I consider feed the world as the maize, wheat, and rice do. There's only about 30 crops that we really depend on as a food source, whereas hunter-gatherers gathered hundreds and hundreds of different types of plants. That just isn't the case anymore. Our farms, our crops are extremely uniform. They're replacing the land races. There still are land races grown in some places in the world, but it's by choice by those farmers, and usually because they don't sell a lot of the product. They eat the product locally or on the farm. And all these land races are now, not all of them, unfortunately, but a great number of them are stored in national seed storage labs in the United States and other places. We have approximately 600,000 accessions of crops and related species stored in the United States. There's large collections in the Soviet Union, India, China, Brazil, and Europe. There are also collections in countries in Africa and other countries in Asia. A lot of those are very small. They're not very well maintained. And we've lost a lot of accessions in the United States in our collections because there's not the resources to maintain them, or these land races have special conditions that they have to be grown under, and they just weren't grown under those conditions because the curators didn't know how to do it for those specific accessions. We're in the age of research and genetic improvement. Plant breeding is very, very important for maintaining our food supply, and genetics, modern genetics, but it's still a process of evolution. Modern plant breeding is essentially evolution that is sped up. It's where farmers changed the way plants are grown over centuries. Modern plant breeders can do it in 10 or 15 years. In summary, we are dependent on a very few crops grown by fewer and fewer people. In developed countries, we see very few food shortages because we can buy our food from a lot of places in the world. In poorer countries, there still are widespread famines, and there's a lot of problems with the modern varieties when a disease comes in to devastate their fields and they don't have resistance. And the farmers just take a chance that they can sell their product and for more money instead of just feeding their families.
Tom, I didn't hear you talk about the international gene banks of the CGIAR and Svalbard Seed Bank. Could you add something?
Well, the international, there's been international centers developed starting in the 1970s to collect and preserve and work on to improve specific crops. For instance, the one in India concentrates mostly on peanut, and there's Erie in the Philippines is the Rice Institute. I think there's 17 of these institutes around the world. They've done a major job of developing modern varieties. The Green Revolution was started with wheat, of course, with Warlog when he worked in Mexico. It has spread to other crops, rice in particular. And the major gene banks and organizations are internationally funded. They have done a superb job of studying the different crops that they're responsible for and supporting the farmers and breeders around the world.
Another great summary of where we're at. Now that we've seen an overview of where we've been, Marilyn, would you like to tell us about where we're headed? Where are we going with our BFFs crops?
Absolutely. So today there's around 1,750 gene banks in more than 100 countries, and they contain more than 7.4 million accessions. Accessions are samples, basically, and they can be land races, they can be modern varieties, they can be a sample of seeds from a wild species that's related to a crop. But the majority of the accessions in the gene banks are land races, and these are the culmination of the work of millions of farmers over 10,000 years. And most of these accessions can not be found anywhere else on Earth anymore, so these are massively important. In addition, there's one new gene bank, which opened in 2008, called the Svalbard Seed Vault. And it's located as close to the North Pole as they could get it. And it's the backup. So it invites seeds from every gene bank in the world to be placed into cold storage in perpetuity, basically. So for all of mankind. So it's a great backup in case anything goes wrong at any of the local gene banks, which happens. Now, this massive collection around the whole world is invaluable, but only if the treasures are taken out of the banks and used. So entries in the germplasm collections, they need to be evaluated phenotypically, which means you have to take them out to the field or to the greenhouse and grow them and see what they're good for. What traits do they have that we can use? And then they also need to be evaluated genetically in the lab. We need to look at the DNA. We need to see which useful traits and genes and DNA sequence variation each one has that can be used to breed new and improved cultivars. So a lot of the crops and the related species are poorly represented in gene banks, either due to the fact that they were never collected and now they're gone, sometimes due to death of the entries, and in these cases, new collections should be undertaken before it's too late. There should be better germplasm exchange between countries, especially if I've lost something in my gene bank, you have it in yours. There should be an easy exchange between countries, but as you might imagine, it's not always easy for political reasons, not for biological reasons, but sometimes for biological reasons as well. Tropical plants don't grow well in Canada, for example. The origins, the evolution, and the relationships between many crop species and their wild relatives are still not well known, not well understood. They should be studied. And now using DNA technology, this is an easy thing to do. Methods should be improved to efficiently conserve and use wild species for crop improvement. And then some crops, for example, some are vegetatively reproduced, and sometimes they're sterile. For example, if they're a cross between two related species, like peppermint is a hybrid between watermint and spearmint. It is sterile and it doesn't have a lot of genetic variation in it, and you can't really breed it very easily because it doesn't set seeds. You can't cross it. So what you can do, though, is to recreate the cross. You can make new crosses between watermint and spearmint and come up with different varieties that way. That would allow plant breeders to access more genetic variation and thus improve plants for disease resistance or higher yield. This has been done very successfully, for example, with wheat, which is a cross between 3 different original species. So by recreating it, breeders brought in many new useful genes.
I didn't know that about wheat. What a fun fact. Yeah, that sounds like so much promising work. We've talked about seed banks on the show before. Love them to death. They're the coolest. They're the coolest things. So thanks for reminding me of how great they are. Got re-excited listening to you. I've got 3 questions left for you. So the first one is, if people want to learn more about any of these topics, obviously there is the book. We'll have a discount code in our show notes that will be active through the end of the month, I believe. So make sure you get on that. But also, what are maybe 1 or 2 other resources that people could look into for more information about these things?
There's been other books written. There's one by Hancock called Plant Evolution and Origin of Crop Species. That's a very good book on crop plant evolution. It's much more technical than the book we wrote, and it's a great resource. There's also a lot of information on the Crop Science website about crop plant evolution and gene banks and germplasm resources.
And we also sponsor Crop Wild Relative Week every year, where we have new blogs and new information. You can learn more about those. And I'll have to point out that the USDA ARS has a great website at the National Laboratory for Genetic Resource Preservation. They've got excellent infographics and lots of useful teaching information as well.
Great. We will include links to all of those in our show notes. Be sure to check them out. Second question is, if people then want to take the next step and maybe get involved in these kinds of research or teaching opportunities, what can they do to get involved?
They can grow heirloom varieties of crops and join societies. There's lots of societies like the gourd societies or tomato societies or other heirloom local societies, or their local herbarium at universities or botanical societies. They can volunteer at K through 12 schools to make presentations about a particular crop or plant, that to get young people interested in crop plant evolution or and plants in general. Young people have to be exposed to plants and ideas to get them interested in future vocations and activities. And for students at universities, take a crop evolution course or a plant breeding course and learn something about plant breeding and where your crops came from.
We'd also like to suggest that you can advocate for the conservation of plant genetic resources by the USDA ARS. Write your congressman. These are important things. And you can also support the Crop Trust, which is an international organization that supports all gene banks globally.
Great. Those are some great suggestions. Be sure to do those if you are interested. Final question for you. What is one fun fact that people would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Well, I'm an aquatics instructor, Boy Scout aquatics instructor and lifeguard, and I teach whitewater canoeing and kayaking.
So I'm currently between hobbies because I've spent the past 22 years as a single working mom of two wonderful sons, and I've had a fantastic career. So all of this hasn't actually left me much time for other activities, but also not much need for other activities because frankly, I would do my job for free. I like it that much, but you don't have to tell my boss that. And in addition, when you have kids, they really pull you out of your comfort zone. You get to do amazing things with them. You do things that you never thought you would do. For example, I am now sporting a tattoo on my ankle. My two sons have identical tattoos. I did not think I was a tattoo person, but now I have one.
Wow. Can I ask what it is? Is that too personal? You don't have to answer.
No, not at all. It's a sunset and a saguaro cactus because we spend all of our Christmases in Arizona and we do love it.
Oh, I love that. That's very cute. Thank you so much for a great conversation. We have covered thousands of years of history in like an hour. So way to go, us. And thank you so much for your time and being on the show.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for letting us promote our book. Please buy it. It's a good read.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find links to today's resources in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcasts if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by guests are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.